So Thomas Aquinas is one of the most important thinkers, not just in Christian tradition, but for Western culture. Many of his arguments on the state, for example, were used by Thomas Jefferson when he was writing the Declaration of Independence. Many of his arguments for natural law are used for human rights. And many of his arguments of sex are still prominent today. Thomas Aquinas is one of the most important figures because he starts the process of the modern world. He starts the process of the age of reason. Thomas Aquinas argues that humans are rational creatures. And so he comes up with what he thinks are reasonable ways to explain the world. And one of those ways of reason are reasonable ways of explaining the existence of God. He says faith and reason should come together so that you can no longer say, well, God exists because the Bible tells me so, or God exists because my priest told me so. Aquinas will have none of this. He says that in order to argue that God exists, you must do so rationally. And so he comes up with these 5 arguments for the existence of God. Now it's important to note that Aquinas says that God does not exist in the same way that you and I exist. God is not part of the material world, but creates the material world. This is important, and we'll see why. Aquinas' first argument comes from Aristotle, and Aristotle says that God is the unmoved mover. And what Aquinas and Aristotle end up saying is that just look out into the material world. Just look, and you will see that everything that's in motion is caused by something else. This is basically Newtonian physics, what Aristotle and Aquinas are talking about. And so if you go back in time, just looking at the natural world, you will see that there must be a first mover, something that isn't moved by something else, but causes everything else to be moved. So this is basically looking out into the natural world and coming up with the existence of God. So that's the first argument. The second argument is that God is the first cause. So nothing in and of itself causes itself to come into existence. If it did, it would exist prior to its existence. So if you look back in history, you will see that God is the first cause, that which is not caused by anything else, but causes everything else. So that's his second argument. The third argument is contingency, which basically means dependency. So he looks to the physical world and sees that everything is dependent on something else. So there must be something at the very beginning that's not dependent on anything else in order to cause this material world that's dependent on everything within it and ultimately dependent on God. The fourth argument is the argument of degree. And so Aquinas will argue that the way that you know something is good is comparing it by something that's better or not as good. And so he'll say you compare something that's good to something that's better, to something that's better, to something that's even better, until you get to the greatest thing that you can think of, and that is God. The fifth argument is the teleological argument, which means the end or the purpose of something. So everything has a purpose. A saw's purpose is to cut down a tree. A hammer's purpose is to hammer. Well, what gives it these purpose? Humans do. What is the purpose of a human? Christianity says to love. And what gives it this purpose? Aquinas would say God. God gives us this purpose. Now, do these arguments work? Some people think they do, and some people think that they don't. I think that they are good evidence for the existence of God, but I don't think that they are proof for the existence of God. Now, some people will say it's not good evidence at all. Immanuel Kant will end up arguing against Thomas Aquinas and saying that if everything is in motion, God must be in motion too. But Aquinas says that God isn't in motion. And the trap that Kant gets into is thinking that God is part of the material world. God is distinct, different from the material world, not part of the material world. We can't examine God as a material thing as we can examine a book or another person's body. We can't do that with God. And so this is evidence that God exists, not proof. that God exists. Now, the problem that I have with Aquinas is that he puts so much emphasis on reason. He says that any rational human being will be able to see that these are proofs for God's existence and will not question it. But the problem is that humans are not entirely rational. We're emotional creatures. And in that way, we are not always convinced by rational arguments. And indeed, we can rationally argue against what somebody else thinks is a rational argument. What's more important to me than coming up with arguments for the existence of God is living into the God who is love. The God who seeks to love even the enemies of God, which brings us to this very important question that we'll discuss next time. Aquinas' arguments, he fully admits, doesn't necessarily argue for the existence of the Christian God. What is the Christian God like? And that's what we're going to explore next time with the help of Sam Harris, a popular atheist, modern-day atheist. So I hope you join me then. Thanks.